In this video, I want to show you how to create what I call invisible fill lights. These are for times when your scene needs more light and you want to feel that the light's there, but not necessarily know that it's there or see it. So that's cases where you need to add a light, and where it needs to be to do the job you want means it either has to show up in camera or it's going to show up in some reflections. So this is a tool that's going to give you the ability to hide those lights and yet still get the effect of them. A common example of this sort of situation is like the one you see here, an interior scene or an environmental scene where you've got light that's primarily coming in from outside through a door or a window, and there's a lot of global illumination that's creating the bulk of the lighting in and around the room, and you're not quite getting enough out of that. That's very typical, like real life lighting. You would need to add some fill lights to this as well. But anyway, it's trying to create this natural looking lit scene without making it look overlit. And when you've got something like this, where you've got either visible light sources like the windows in the frame, or you have a lot of reflective objects, adding lights can be problematic because they're going to show up in the reflections. For example, this one here, this is a shot that I think needs a little bit of fill. And if we do the sort of obvious fix and add a fill light, it definitely does the job. It creates a lot more oomph in the scene. But you can see in the reflections here on the sugar dispenser and primarily on the cup that there's a large white light source there. And that's what I'm talking about with a fill light. That's kind of an obvious thing. So instead, if we turn that off and have a look at the invisible approach, you can see that it looks quite a bit different. It's going to give it a sec to resolve, but you can see that the reflection is more complex. It looks like it's reflecting the room. It's not. What it's reflecting is this light source here, which has an image of the room mapped onto it. And that gives me what I would call an invisible light. It's still there. It's actually visible, but in the reflections, you can't really tell that that's what it is. And with this tool, I can move this around and create, different types of reflections. I'm just going to switch this over to lit mode for a moment so we can see this a little faster. Lit mode and unlit path tracing do not look exactly the same, particularly since ray tracing has come out of the lit mode and you just have lumen. The lighting doesn't look exactly the same. So there's a limit to how much you can use lit mode as a preview for path tracing, but it is still pretty fast when you're looking to position reflections and see what things are doing. But you can see what we can do here is move this around and change what aspects of the room are being reflected in the scene, and in the cup in particular. If I switch again to the other one, you can see here more clearly what's going on. So not only is the reflection flat and white and obviously looking like a light source that's in the room, it's also creating a flat and evenly toned and colored light source versus the mapped version here, this invisible light, which is picking up dark and light shading from the texture map and creating dark and light shading from the reflection. It's picking up color and hue from the scene, and it looks much more natural. You would never know there's a light there. If you just need to get light in there and you don't need to worry about reflections, you can do this in a more simple way with just a straight Rect light or by turning off the light plane. And now you just have the Rect light that's filling in. In this case, it works because I have the specular turned off by default on the Rect light that's included in the UltraLight. But if you're doing this with an Unreal Rect light, you're going to have to go in yourself and take the specular scale down to 0. And then you're just getting diffuse. That can be a nice way to do it too. Sometimes that works just fine, especially if you just want a little bit of fill. For me, I kind of preferred having the control over having the reflection there as well, which is one of the main advantages of using the UltraLight versus a Rect light, is you have separate control over the reflective plane and the direct to diffuse illumination source. One of the other advantages of working with this method, this split between the light plane, the reflective plane, and the light, is that it allows you to control the relative brightness of things like the reflections or a directly visible light, which we'll look at in the next example, but between the reflection and the amount of diffused light. So perhaps we want the fill light to feel a little bit stronger, or maybe we want the reflection to feel a little bit stronger without changing the amount of diffused light. By taking the light plane intensity up, let's take that up to something obvious so we can see it. So we're brightening up the reflected component here, but the diffuse light is not being adjusted. Or we can do the opposite, and we can take the diffuse light up and not necessarily affect the brightness of the reflection. You may or may not want it. It depends on what you want this to feel like. Now it's starting to feel more like there's an off-camera window that's not necessarily reflected in there, which feels a little bit strange. That's too bright. But you get the idea that having that separate control means you can have a much more nuanced approach to what shows up and where in the shot. Maybe I don't want the reflection to be quite that strong, but I want the bounce light to be stronger. And that changes that ratio. If you're happy with the ratio between the reflection and the light, then using the master intensity lets you take the whole thing up or down together. Yeah, you just work with it until you find something that feels right to you and to your eye. Just say something like that for the time being is fine. So yeah, having that separate control allows you to either use the reflection or not use the reflection. And to change the reflection, you can change the scale and the positioning of it and have a strong effect on what shows up in your shot. There's other things we can do with this, particularly with the second of the two methods I'm going to show you, which uses render targets. That's what's happening here. We'll come back to that when I show you how these are built. Let's have a look at another example first, though. In this example, we have something a little bit different. Here, we've got the light source visible to the camera. It's a little less about reflections in this case and more about separating the visible component of the light from its effects in the scene. So right now, the outside brightness is at a level I'm relatively happy with. I don't necessarily want it to be a whole lot brighter, but the room itself doesn't feel lit enough from the exterior. I'm mostly feeling the interior lights and not enough of the daylight. So it is certainly possible to go in and take the directional light and take the intensity up, but it quickly starts to blow things out. The speculars get really hot. The outside scene is getting brighter than I want it to be. And if I want to be able to control that separately, I need to do this a different way. This would be equivalent to cranking up the overall exposure, more or less. That's another approach. But again, everything comes up, and I'm not necessarily looking to have these bright highlights and reflections get a whole lot brighter than they already are. So what we can do instead is look at adding a fill light that creates more of that exterior illumination feeling kicking into the room. So a way to address this is to create a fill light. In this case, I've got a couple of options to show you. First is a straightforward Rect light. This is outside the window. It's actually an UltraLight, but at the moment only the Rect light's active, so it's more or less acting exactly like an Unreal Rect light would. The only difference is specularity is by default turned to 0 on the Rect light, so that the light plane can drive the reflections. If you use a straight off the shelf Rect light, it's going to have reflections. It's going to show up as well. Let me show you what that looks like. So if we go here and we look at the specular scale, in my case, on the UltraLight, that's set to 0 by default. But if you add a Rect light of your own, it's going to look like that. So what we want in this case is light, but not the reflection. So if you're doing this with a Rect light, just go into the specular scale and set it to 0. Now we just have a light source that's creating diffuse illumination. In this case, because there's nothing that's going to necessarily directly reflect the light, and we don't want direct reflections of the light, this might be all we need. Just have to play around a little bit with the color of the light and the brightness of the light to get it to a feel that we like. The things that I don't like about it is that it's a uniform color all the way across and a uniform brightness all the way across, and it's not necessarily doing exactly what I might like it to do. It doesn't look exactly like a natural light might. And the other thing is I wanted to have separate control over the brightness of what it's doing inside and the brightness of the world outside in a more controllable fashion. So I turn that off and I turn on this version. This is the invisible light version. You can see what I've got here is a screenshot of the world mapped to the light on a light plane. And the Rect light is separate. And with this, I've got control of the brightness of the Rect light and control of the brightness of the world separate, and amongst other things that I can do, such as adjusting the world around, moving it back and forth, or as you can see in this case, what I've actually got on this is a bit of the textured blur that's built into UltraLight, and you can use that to simulate a little bit of depth of field, just like an added bonus of having that as a separate tool. I'll just leave that off for now. But if we turn this off and on, you can see that it's brightened up relative to the world, but it's not actually affecting the shot in the same way. Actually, let me do that with the light plane, because that is affecting everything. If I turn the light plane off and on, the illumination stays the same, but the brightness is different. So if I wanted that light plane to drop back, I can make it a little darker, closer to the original scene. And again, I've got that advantage of being able to tweak my composition without having to move the world around, and change my lighting without having to move the world around. So what you end up with is a light that's doing lots of subtle things for you. You can see the light that's coming in Here is a more modulated by the texture map. It's got color and brightness variation that the straight up fill light doesn't have. And you've got that control over it. So that's sort of the two examples of how invisible lights are used. It's whenever you can see the light and you don't want to see the light either directly or indirectly through reflections, and you want to have separate control over how visible the reflections are versus the brightness is contributing, or how bright the various components are. All of those are addressed with this method. So I'm going to show you how this is done. There's two ways of doing it. In both cases, what you want to do is capture part of the scene, map that to a light source and or a reflective plane, and use that as a source of illumination. That can be done using high-res screenshots from position to cameras, or it can be done using rendered targets and scene capture cameras. The second is a more advanced, slightly more complicated, a little bit more time-consuming to set up, but much more flexible approach in the long run. But the high-res screenshot is a method I use all the time. That's what's happening here on this scene. I will show you that one first, and then we'll go back to the mug and have a look at the render target approach there. So starting with method one, which is the high-res screenshot method, there's just a few steps. We need to set up a camera for the screenshots. That's not absolutely necessary. You can just render a viewport, but if you want repeatable results, setting up a camera is better. You need to shoot that screenshot, save it, import it back in as a texture, map the texture to the texture slot of the UltraLight, and then make adjustments as needed. So let's start with that. So if we go to the one that we have outside, which is this one here, let's just delete that. And we'll delete, let's just leave the other one out there for now. So this is the light that has no light plane activated. Let's just turn that on. We'll use this one as our baseline. That's kind of positioned already. So for now, we're just going to hide that. So what we need to do now is position ourselves, roughly at the position of the window and seeing what the window will see. Let's just switch this to a viewport. Let's say something like that. And the quickest way to jump to the next sort of step is to create a camera at this position. So I'll create a camera actor or cinema camera actor here. Right, so that camera's been created. So now we just want to rename that really quickly to something sensible. High-res screenshot, window 2. And then we'll just switch our view to that camera. And at this point, we can adjust this camera now and position it in a way that makes sense with what we want to do with the view to match the view or what we want to see through there. So in this case, I think what we're probably going to do is take that camera and widen out the field of view just a little bit. So we're going to look at the lens length. Go to 16. You can do that with the camera settings, or you can actually just do that with the viewport as well, just by navigating and flying the camera around. If you don't need to actually change the lens settings, come up just a little bit. And then I think we want to see just a little bit more verticality there to cover off what we're seeing from the window, through the window, I should say. So let's grab that. And let's maybe make that a 14 mil lens. Yeah. So this is showing more than obviously what we see through the window, but that gives us a bit of breathing room to move things around. So now that we have that, we can maximize this viewport. And what we want to do is render the high-res screenshot. There's a couple of little things, a couple of gotchas we have to be aware of. One is that the post-process volume is having an effect on this scene, and it's set up now to cool off using the white balance a little bit, cool the scene off. If we render the high-res screenshot with this active, and then bring this high-res screenshot back in as a texture, the high-res screenshot will have the post-process effects baked in, and then will be under those effects again, so it'll end up doubly affected, so it will look really cool. So whenever you're doing this sort of an approach where you're baking something like the high-res screenshot method, you want to turn off the post-process volume so that when it comes back in to the scene and you turn the post-process volume back on, it looks natural. So we'll just turn that off. And then taking a high-res screenshot is pretty straightforward. You just need to do a high resolution screenshot from that menu. So right now the size multiplier is set to 1, which means it's going to render at the resolution of the screen, roughly 2K. That's fine for what we're doing right now. Before we do this actual screenshot, we want to make sure we're in path tracing mode so that it's going to match what our final render is going to look like. And if we hit capture, it's going to go fairly quickly. This little window pops up. If you catch it in time, you can grab the default storage location pretty quickly. But if you can't, if you miss that little window, you just need to go into your content folder, saved, screenshots, Windows Editor, and it'll be the most recent one there. Pop that open in Photoshop. You can see this is the other gotcha when you're working with path tracing. Regardless of what the viewport looks like, it might be fully rendered. The screenshot is going to restart the render in the background, and it's going to grab a single frame, and it's not going to resolve very well depending on how quickly your path trace image is resolving. So there's a workaround for that. I'm just going to close this off and close that one off. And that is a console command, which I will paste into the comments below so you can see it. We're just going to go up. And it's this high-res screenshot delay. Essentially, what you want to do is set that to a number that matches the anti-aliasing settings that you think are sufficient for what you need to do. If you want it to be maximal resolution, you would set it to 124, 2048, whatever it is your final path trace render is going to look like. But for this sort of thing where it's background and it's lower res because it's pushed away from the camera, less is probably fine. So I'm going to set this to 1024. And now note when I hit this capture button, it's going to take quite a bit longer to capture. I'll probably pause the recording. So that took about 35, 40 seconds. But if we crack open the screenshot, you can see it's quite a bit cleaner. So this is the one that we're going to use. Obviously, this little blob is here. If that's going to be a factor for you, that would disappear once it's fully rendered. You can either set it to, so that this renders completely and that disappears, or quickly Photoshop that out. In our case, it's out of frame. It's not going to be an issue, so we can just leave that alone. So now we've got this screenshot. You can see some previous testing that's been done. But if I grab this guy here and re-import it, I'm going to drag it into this folder that I created called Render Targets. It's got my older tests in it. I'm going to drag that in. And we can also rename that to something sensible. Something that matches the camera might be helpful. And we can close this now. And now we can go back out to the original camera. And if we leave this camera here, if we ever need to make any changes or subtle variations to this, we can always reference back to this camera and capture a new screenshot. Because this is now baked, anything that changes in the scene is going to require a new render. So having the camera there for the later is probably a good idea. Anyway, back to camera 2. And because the post-process volume has been turned off, the camera exposures are all messed up. So we'll just turn that back on and everything will look normal again. You can actually switch this exterior view. So now what we want to do is grab that light, the exterior light that we've been using, which is this one here. Turn it back on again. Light plane's active. Now I want to go to the texture of that light. And where we have this white scale, we just want to drag and drop that in. Obviously, the scale looks a little crazy. That looks like the blur might be turned on by default here too. I'm going to just turn that off. So now this scene can be moved around and repositioned as we need it to. Just have a quick reference. We can just toggle this off and on and sort of get a sense of where it needs to match up. And one thing we can do to get us closer is to look at the proportions. The shot was rendered, the screenshot was rendered at roughly 16:9. So if we set this to 16:9 proportion, it should get us to a pretty decent starting point anyway. Now we can match this up more or less accurately for size and position, depending on how much accuracy we require. You can tell because we're rendering from a different perspective, we've got reflective surfaces. What you're seeing in the glass windows is slightly different. We could fix that by rendering the screenshot from something more approximating the camera angle of the view camera. But in this case, I don't think it's anything that's that critical. It is a little bit bright though, so now we can just go down to the light plane intensity. Scale is maybe just a little bit big overall, so I'll lock that so it's proportional. Go down ever so slightly. For this kind of thing, again, jumping back into lit mode will be useful. It doesn't give you an accurate representation of what the reflections look like or the brightness necessarily, but for scaling and positioning, it's pretty handy. The other thing we can do is use the texture controls and affect how that looks. Using the contrast and brightness saturation controls if we wanted to. It's another way of changing how that image appears. It's a little paler, so if we wanted to tint the color of that, we could. Just by adding a little bit of blue. I think that slight mismatch, it has to do with the post-process volume again. But, let's say that that's kind of what we're looking for. Let's maximize this again. So now we've got this light in here. We've got the texture map on it. We can control the lighting separately, the brightness of the image separately, as I showed in the earlier part. Again, we've got the option to use the blurs. Anything we want to do with that texture, we can do. Play around with depth of field. We can use the gradients to affect the shot as well if we wanted to. Use a linear gradients. Let's see which way I want to go. Rotate that. Play with the offset. Might be easier to see what that's doing from outside. We want to maybe tone down the top just a little bit. And off. And then on. Yeah, something like that. I think overall it's a little bit cool, so I'm just going to go back to the global tint. Or we can leave that alone and adjust the base color, which is what we tinted before, and just take some of that blue out. The base color and the global tint are both multiplied across the area light and the light plane, so they will affect both equally when you're doing this with the ultralight. And I should be checking this brightness with path tracing on because it does look different. Let's let that resolve. Yeah, so in path trace resolve, that looks a little heavy to me. So I think what we'll do is we'll adjust that and take the light plane intensity up. I think we'll also knock out that color. I think that was an artifact of looking at it in lit mode. Leave that as neutral. And should match better. Yeah, there we go. Give it that a sec. Yeah, so that's the technique using high-res screenshots. The downside of this is if you wanted to make any significant change to the time of day, if we grab the directional light and we're doing something a lot later in the day, and that exterior light should be quite a bit different. We're not seeing that in the scene here because our high-res screenshot is not reflecting those changes. So we made it nighttime, but you can't tell. This is where using render target would be a much more useful approach. So we'll look at that one next. Here we are back at the other shot. We've got the visible version of the ultralight version of that here in the shot. We're going to use this as our baseline. We're going to map to this just because it's already positioned conveniently, so we'll save a bit of time. It is a little bit trickier to set up, but not a whole lot. There are a number of steps involved. Step 1 is to create a render target texture. Step 2 is to make some changes to the size and some parameters on that. Step 3 is to create a scene capture 2D camera. Then we need to link the render target to that scene capture camera. Then we need to take that render target and map it to the ultralight as a texture. And then finally, we can make some adjustments to both the ultralight and the render target camera, the scene capture camera, sorry. Then we can make some changes as necessary to the ultralight, its position and brightness and the mapping, and also to the scene capture device, which is going to allow us to pick up different parts of the room and the environment as needed and change what's being shown in the reflection via the ultralight. So step 1 is to create the render target. If you're not familiar with render targets, there are quite a few good YouTube videos that'll teach you how to use them. That's how I learned. I'm just going to walk you through the steps in a very straightforward way right now. So in a content browser folder, which I've got here, render targets I've created, you can see the earlier testing that I've been doing. I'm just going to type in render and render target. This basic one is the one we're looking for. We'll just rename the texture that it creates to cup fill version 2. And we'll just double click to open it. You'll see by default what it creates is a 256 by 256 RGBA 16 float image. That's a little bit small. We can change this resolution to whatever we need. I would start with something moderate, maybe detail at 124. We can use 60-bit float. If you want to save a little bit of texture memory, you can drop this back to RGBA 8-bit. If you're doing something like the exterior that we did with the screenshot, then you want to be able to crank the exposure of that up and down quite a ways without having the highlights and shadows blow out or gray out really quickly because it's an 8-bit image. Choosing a 32-bit float here will give you a HDR image that you can map to the light, and then you'll have lots of room to play with the brightness and contrast without losing detail. But for what we're doing right now, this is all we need. So we've got a little bit higher res and 8-bit format. We're just going to save that and close it out. So the next thing we need now is the scene capture camera to map this texture to, and that we find by going up to here and typing scene capture. Scene capture 2D is the one that we want. It's going to drop it into some random place in the scene, which is a very fun Unreal thing. I'm just going to select the light, right-click and copy its location, find the scene capture camera, and I'm going to paste the location here. That's going to align the camera to the light, and that's basically what we want, is to be almost creating what you would look at if you were the camera was the back of the light. What does it see? So we'll just rotate this around 180 degrees. Basically, because we're going to play with this a little bit too, so we don't have to be too precise. And I'm just going to move it so that it's on the other side of the light. So what that camera is now seeing is the room from this point of view. And what we want to do now is take the texture target that we've created, the render target, and add it as the texture target to that scene capture. So we drag and drop that in, and then we double click that to open a texture. Now we're seeing what the camera's seeing. And this is a live update. So if we move this camera around, then what's rendered onto that texture will move around as well. Now, obviously, it just doesn't look a whole lot like what our scene looks like, and we're going to need to do that, have it match a bit better. So if we go back over to the scene capture parameters, and there's a few things we can change. One is the field of view. This is similar to what we were doing with the camera that we set up for high-res screenshots. If we increase this field of view, we can pick up a little bit more of the room, or a little bit less, depending on what we want. I think because we can make that light as big or small and move around as much as we want, I tend to make this a little bit of a wider field of view. And then going down here, we can look at the format that's capturing. So scene color HDR is probably where you're going to want it to be. But one thing that's really important for using path tracing is to use ray tracing if enabled. If we turn that on, now it's going to look a lot more like the shot. And you can play around now with scene color versus final color. I find that this can be a little bit, finicky. Just play around with what looks the closest. One of the issues that we have with this is the other gotcha that I mentioned earlier with the post-process volume, when we end up with is a double-corrected version because the camera is capturing the final scene color, and then it's being mapped with the post-process volume on it twice. So going with final color is going to give you a somewhat different result for sure. Either one can work. You can also go in HDR, which might be a way to go if you wanted to get that extra range. But for what we're doing for this particular situation, scene color HDR is probably as close as we're going to get because we have control of this texture in the ultralight. We can adjust the brightness, contrast, color, and match it up a bit better that way, which is a lot faster, I think, than messing around with these. So we'll just leave everything as is for now. I'm going to save this and close it. So now we have this texture. Now what we want to do is map it to the light. So if we click on the ultralight and then we go to the texture section, you can see by default it has this white skirmish. Now we just drag and drop this in there. You can see it's now picking up the scene capture, but obviously that's pretty dark. And now we're just going to go to the intensity controls and bring up our light plane intensity. Let's set it to something pretty bright. And then we just visually want to match up kind of roughly what the scene looks like or what we want it to look like. Bring that intensity up even more if we want it to be brighter. Bring up the Rect light because the Rect light is also being affected by this texture. When you use it in the ultralight, we're going to have to bring up the intensity because the texture is modulating that Rect light down quite a bit. Tinting it as well, which is good. Again, we've got that double correction kind of thing happening with the post-process volume, which is why this looks bluer, I think cooler than the rest of the world. But when we've got the texture in the ultralight, we can use the tints, the base tint, and the global tint to make changes to that. If we add some more warmth to that, we can get it to match a bit better. It's a little green, so we'll shift it over to more of an orange color. Yeah, something like that. I'm just going to switch over to lit mode so we can see the reflection and adjust it a little bit faster. So here we are. We've got this thing. We can bring it in and out. We can move it up and down. We can change all of that, but we also can take the scene capture device, and if we wanted to, we could radically change what's being reflected. And you notice it's updating really, really quickly, which is great. It doesn't take very long at all for this to work. We'll put it back sort of roughly where it was. Getting some glitches when the light starts to penetrate the scene capture camera, but once you settle in, it should be fine. Now, again, the advantage to this is if we make broad scale changes to the scene, for example, we could take this door if we wanted to, for whatever reason, open that door or hide it. It's going to show up right away in the reflection. You can see as the room darkens, so does our reflection because the image is being updated constantly. So this is a really, really handy way of creating a live scene that updates and allows you a lot more flexibility. And if you're done and you're happy and you don't think you're making any of the changes, you can always take your texture, choose to go into Asset Actions and Export, and you can export it as a PNG file, and then re-import that PNG file or JPEG, whatever, back in as a texture here, and then apply that to the light, and then you've got a baked result, and then you can disable the scene capture camera, and it's no longer going to be using up any resources. And if you need to change it again, you can just go back, update the scene, reuse the render target, recreate the JPEG or PNG if you need to, and you're off and running. But for the most part, for my workflow, I almost never need to do that. I just let the scene capture run on its own. It doesn't seem to have much of an impact for me. Your mileage, of course, may vary. So yeah, that's basically the overview. The high-res screenshot is quick, it's effective, but if you want something that's got more flexibility and versatility, or you want to create radically different types of reflections, like for example, you just want to reflect a totally different part of the scene or see a different part of the scene out of the window, you can move the camera around and have a look at another section of your environment and change what you see through the window really, really quickly without having to change anything in the world. So there's a lot of power in that tool. And again, it's just a better way of creating some subtle control over your lighting. And as you advance in your skills as a lighter, it's those little nuanced changes and the subtle control over brightness of reflection and diffuse light and positioning of lights that's going to make or break your shots and make them that much better. So I think that covers everything that I wanted to cover. If you have any questions or comments, please drop them down below or head over to the Discord channel and reach out to me there. You probably get a faster response. I'm happy to provide any support I can for the UltraLight. I'm also happy to provide any tips or tricks about CG lighting and share some of my experience with you if you need some help. So reach out anytime. Thanks very much. Don't forget to drop a like and subscribe if you don't mind as well. Much appreciated. Also, if you're a customer and you've purchased the UltraLight, please think about leaving a review on the Fab Store. Those help me quite a bit with moving forward with updates and progress with the UltraLight. Thank you very much. Happy lighting.